Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me this afternoon and for the technology that makes it so I can be there remotely. As Megan said, my name is Caitrin Chapelle. I'm Associate Director of the Water Policy Center at PPIC, and I'm excited to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is how to communicate science to policymakers. I will spend a few minutes telling you about myself and about PPIC and what we are, who we are, and what we do, and then how we do it, and then a little bit on some tools and tricks for communicating with the folks who make policy decisions. Just a little bit on, before I start, as Megan said, I love being interrupted for questions, so don't feel like you have to wait until the end if there's a question or if I'm not being very clear as I'm going through this presentation. So just a little bit more on me. I have been at the Public Policy Institute of California for about 6 years now. Before coming to PPIC, I worked as a biologist for the USGS, for the United States Geological Survey, and I did water quality and ecosystem work in the Bay Delta. And after doing that for a few years, I wanted to make the transition to do exactly what we're going to be talking about today, which is to transition to making science more impactful in policy and decision making, especially in California water issues. So I went and got my master's degree in public policy from the Goldman School at UC Berkeley, and I've been at PPIC ever since finishing that program. At PPIC, my job is kind of a catch-all for our work. I manage the operations of our center, while also helping with strategy on communications and topics that we work on, as well as managing the actual research projects themselves for a lot of our collaborators and researchers. So like I mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about PPIC, who we are, what we do, and how we do it, and look forward to your questions if you have any. So just a little bit of background on the topic that I work on, because as I talk through my slides today, I'm going to be using California water and the issues around California water as examples of how we have communicated with policymakers at PPIC. And just as a little bit of a asterisk to start this whole presentation, everything I tell you today is what works for us at PPIC. It's trial and error. We're learning all the time. And so all the things I'm going to share with you today are from personal experience over the last 6 years and what's been successful and what at the center has worked for us when we're trying to implement change in California water policy. So just a little bit of background for those who might need it on water in California. It's a contentious and complex issue. It's one in which there are very big challenges around water supply, around water quality, around ecosystems, and around infrastructure and costs. And it's a topic in which there is significant interest at the local, regional, state, and federal level by managers and policymakers to make changes, either for specific interests, such as making changes that they think will better the economy or the environment, or changes to make sure that as Californians, we're using water efficiently. So there's a lot of people around the table when we're talking about California water. And as part of that, there has been in the past a prevalence of combat science and policy debates that rely on myths and misconceptions. And that's where the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center comes into play. What we do at PPIC is we're an independent, nonpartisan think tank that works on a range of issues impacting California. And the Water Policy Center focuses on 3 interconnected challenges relating to water policy: ensuring clean and reliable water supplies, building healthy and resilient ecosystems, and preparing for droughts and floods. So on these range of topics, we use targeted research, public outreach, and engagement to achieve policy impacts and change. We do this through a range of in-depth research and broad array of shorter products. So at PPIC, we can have books, we can have 100-page technical reports, while at the same time we do 2-page fact sheets. And I'll speak about that a little bit later, which is that using the right type of product for the right type of audience. We have an expansive research team. We work with both in-house and outside expertise. We have a lot of collaborators at UC Davis. And we try to link our challenges with solutions. So through our work, we try to make recommendations on pathways forward. And on top of all of that, we do public events, workshops, and one-on-one meetings to not only get the work and the messages that we have out there, but also to inform the work that we do along the way. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So in the nonprofit and foundation world, this is what would be known as, what you're seeing on my slides right now is what would be known as a conceptual model or a logic model. And that's just a fancy way of saying this is a visual of how we imagine us doing our work and how we're making the impacts that we'd like to make. So on the left-hand side of this in the blue is everything that the Water Policy Center does. And the right-hand side is how we see us having impact and outcomes in California water policy. And I'm showing this to you today to indicate for you, or to highlight for you an example of the thought that goes into when you're doing work to try to influence policy. So one of the biggest things about communicating science to policy is to be very intentional about it. And at the Water Policy Center, we're so intentional about it, we have a figure about how we're doing it, a graph that describes what we're trying to do. One of the things about communicating to policymakers is you can't just expect people to care about what you're doing. You can't expect people to understand about what you're doing. You can't expect people to trust what you're doing. So everything that we do at the Water Policy Center, from the audiences that we engage, to the way that we prioritize our research questions, to the teams that we build, and then to the products and outreach activities that we do all those things at the front end of our work in order to try to make what we do next the most impactful. And the other reason why I'm showing this is because it's unrealistic to think that any research that you do, or any products that you make, or any science or any new discoveries that you make will just all of a sudden change the world. Usually when you're trying to communicate science to policymakers, it's because you need to be increasing understanding within the policy community about an issue. You need to get people starting to care about it. You need to get people starting to champion about it. And all those things will eventually lead to better policy proposals and outcomes. But none of those things, it doesn't go just straight from, I came up with a really great idea, or my science is really interesting, or I found a problem nobody is caring about, straight to a new policy. So this is just a visualization of that concept for all of you. And this is how we do it. And this is the way we track whether or not we're being successful. So when I was thinking, when Megan asked me to talk about the work that we do and how we communicate to policymakers, the first thing I wanted to talk about is to talk about who policymakers are, what the audiences are when you're trying to communicate science to policy, and what that could mean for your research and your work. So the number one thing, number one step, the number one action to take when thinking about wanting your science to be impactful in change and policy is to figure out who is going to care about it. Who is your audience? Who is going to use it? Who needs it? Who has a upcoming decision that could be better made if they had better science? So the number one thing to do is to determine your key audience. And what I've seen and what we see a lot of times is that in science and academia, the audiences is often those who are, it's the journals and the editors of the journals. And when you shift that audience from academia to policy, it can really change the direction of your work and the thinking of your work and the way you present the work, or it should change all those things. I can guarantee you that the way that you do your work, when you're thinking about an audience of a science journal, it will not be impactful for a policymaker because you didn't do that work with them in mind. So just a little bit on when we're thinking about who are policymakers, who do we want to be talking to if we're wanting to make changes or if we're wanting to see impact. The who policymakers are is a really broad question. And so the first step in a lot of communication is to narrow it down. So I'm going to start talking really broadly about who core policy audiences could be, and then I'll give you an example of a time in which we narrowed it significantly. So when you're thinking about California water policy, but I don't think this is just for California water policy, I think this is for most policy areas, there's a core group of folks that are important, and it is usually local, state, and federal officials and the people who work for them. And that's a very important orbit of people. So we're thinking about all the public officials at the local level, state level, even regional level. When you're talking about a state as big as California and a topic as big as water, I mean, we're talking hundreds of agencies just at the local level. We're talking about dozens of state agencies. The federal level, we're talking about federal agencies, but also the Congress and other elected officials. Same with the state level. There's the administration, but then there's also the legislature. So as you can see, as I'm rambling on all these, that's a really big group of people. And sometimes some matter more when you're thinking about the type of work that you do. So making that determination is really important. And a group that people don't often talk about, but are very, very important, is that all of these elected officials and public officials do their work and make their decisions in a world in which they are significantly influenced by a lot of different groups. So when you want to make an impact on policy, you can't just think about the policymakers. You have to think about all the stakeholder groups who help them and influence their decisions. And sometimes that includes the public. So that could be, if something is not polling well publicly, it can be something that a policy maker, especially an elected official, pays very close attention to. So there's the people who are making the policy, and then there are those who are influencing them, and both of them are very important audiences. And then there are other audiences that can help you reach your core audiences, such as the media, getting your work into, media sources on New York Times, Nature. Those are all ways in which you are putting a spotlight on your work for your main audiences to see them. Elected officials pay really close attention to what's happening in the media, mainly because that is a way to gauge the public. Other audiences could be other researchers, because maybe one of your goals is to get a topic or something that you are interested in, more effort being put into it. Maybe it's something that you think that there needs to be more energy towards. So getting other researchers to care about it is important. And then there are policy audiences. This says outside California, but it depends on where you're doing your work. If it's not California focused, there could be policy audiences that are important. So in California, sometimes for the work that we do, we're thinking about folks that work all in water all along the West, because what's happening in Western states can be really impactful on what's happening in California. So all of that is to say that when you're thinking about communicating science to policy, the first step needs to be figuring out, when you say to policy, who do you mean? Not just what change do you need to see, but who is going to make that change. And so step one, determining who those key audiences is, in my opinion, the most crucial point of communicating. I give an example of this all the time when we're talking to folks about work that we did around the drought in 2016. So during the drought from 2012 to 2015 in California, there was a significant push for there to be more conservation around the state. And so we did a look at that, what happened and what the impact was of that conservation in California at the local level. And I remember talking to people and them asking, you know, why are you doing this work, or who is this work for? And the reason we were doing this work was not because we needed everybody in California, just the general public to, this work was not to tell the general public whether or not they did a good job conserving or not. The work that we did and change we were trying to effect was more about the way that agencies were being managed. And so the audiences for that work were specifically water managers and agencies. It was not the water consumers. And then we thought about who influences the way that water managers and agencies are doing their job. And we thought about two main audiences, two main groups that were influencing it. One was the California legislature, because they were passing legislation on conservation and how much people could be using. And the other was the State Water Resources Control Board, which is the statewide agency that has regulatory power over water management. And so we did this work looking at the drought and the impacts of the drought, and we very narrowly identified three audiences for that work. And what this did was it really helped us narrow what we were doing. Because if we had just said, oh, I wonder how California did during the drought, that's a very big topic and it's a very broad idea. And what we wanted to be sure, and I'll get to this later, is to have very targeted messaging for this work. So we defined three audiences before we even got started. So I used this as an example just because you can see that from this previous slide where there's a list of all these policymakers. For this specific project we did, we chose three very specific audiences, which helped us target our communication.
I have a question, Caitrin.
Yeah.
This is a question that was submitted on one of the sign-up forms. How do we get an audience with a policymaker? What's the best way to go about that? Do we cold call them? Do we send them an email? What is your advice?
Well, I'll get to that a little bit later on how to kind of be timely and be relevant for policy, which I think is the most important thing for getting a meeting with a policymaker. But the answer I would say for that is that depending on who it is and what level of government that they are at, if they are an elected official, then everybody who works for them is the information on them is usually available online. And I would target finding staff that are working for, especially an elected official, who have interest in the area that you are trying to work on. So that for usually most legislators and California legislator and also at the federal level, they have a chief of staff, but then they have staffers who work on different policy areas. And that's the level that I would target if we're talking about an elected official, is the staff as a place to start. And yeah, getting on the phone or sending an email. Another nice way to get connected with elected officials is through those stakeholders that I mentioned. So if you know that it's an environmental issue that you're working on, and you know that groups like the Nature Conservancy or Environmental Defense Fund or the Union of Concerned Scientists, that those are all stakeholders that engage on the issue that you're working on, asking them or finding a contact with them is also a good first step, because a huge part of those types of organizations' jobs is to be interacting with policymakers so they can help connect you.
Right.
Okay. So I'll keep going. So the reason this slide is very content heavy, but what I really wanted to put up here was just to give an example of how we defined our audiences as water managers and agencies and a couple other folks, a couple other groups for this work. And therefore, when we did the work itself, we made actions and we prioritized some takeaways that were just for that audience. So this is a slide that I pulled directly from a presentation that we did to water managers. And the thing that I wanted to highlight here is that the actions that that we had for that group were directly targeted towards that audience. And I'll get a little bit more into detail on how you do that next. So the second big thing besides identifying key audiences is to craft your key messages. And this is important to do even before you start your research. And mainly the two kind of the biggest messages or the way to think about key messaging is to ask yourself two questions. One, why are you doing this work? This is kind of a different way of saying, why is your work important? Or why does it matter right now? And then the second question is, why do you do your key audience? Excuse me. What do your key audiences need in order to change how they think or act on this issue? And this is really important because if you're thinking about an issue, excuse me, sorry, if you're thinking about an issue like climate change, for example, very big topic, obviously, but if you're thinking about climate change and you are trying to think about what needed to change or be done to act on this issue, decades ago, the answer to that might have been more information. In order for policy to be happening about climate change, we needed more information on what climate change is and how it's going to impact people. That's changed over time. We're probably at a place now, or I hope we're getting past a place now where what audiences need in order to change how they think or act is a common set of facts. And what I mean by that is a starting place. Do policymakers need a starting place of science or information in order to move and start to make action? Or is this issue at a place where policymakers are ready for recommendations? They need creative ideas. They need case studies. They need new tools. They need new technology. And answering that question for yourself is really important, because if you do some really path-breaking science and you think it's really interesting and you think that recommendations could come out of it on how to change policy, but policymakers aren't there yet because they can't agree on whether or not it's even a problem or there's a solution that's needed, it'll fall on deaf ears. So when you're thinking about your messaging, you kind of have to ask yourself where your audiences are for an issue. And it depends, obviously, like I mentioned, on the issue. But these are the three kind of areas that we've seen that are important, or these are the three kind of categories and then it helps us think about what our product should be or what our messaging should be. And so more information is something that science can really help with. And also, so does a common set of facts. But also, I mean, all three of these things could be really well informed by better science and more science. So I'm going to give an example of when we were trying to provide more information, which is work that we did on water finance in California. So there was a time a few years ago in which people were asking a lot of questions about how do we pay for water management in California and who pays for it. And we realized that that was an opportunity for us to do some work and to help craft some messages around this first topic, which is more information. So everyone was saying that that financing in California water needed to change, but there was also just not a lot of information on who paid for what and where it came from. So for this particular project, we didn't go all the way to making some big policy recommendations. Our goal of it was to just provide really solid information. And the three messages that came out of that report was that and it seems obvious, but it was an important message, which is that successful water management requires adequate and reliable funding. And then the second one was that most water funding is raised by local agencies. This was a really big message for a lot of people to hear, because everyone was talking about getting more federal money or more state money, when in reality, most of the money was being raised by local agencies. So they were a very important audience that wasn't being addressed when thinking about water finance. And then the third was just that there are pieces of the water system that there are pieces of the water system that don't have enough money, and that they're failing management wise because they don't have enough money. So I provide this example, and these were all really impactful messages for policymakers, not because they told them what to do, but because it was stuff that they didn't know yet, or that hadn't been articulated to them in a really clear way, and they needed more information on. And once they had this information, then they could do more action. So this is just a slide that we use all the time to get at that point about the local water agencies. And one of the reasons why I'm throwing these slides from our work in there is also just to show you guys examples of slides that we show policymakers. So you'll see that this is not a very complicated slide. We have the takeaway up there in bold at the top. We don't hide what we want them to know. There's one figure on it, just a few colors, and that's it. And this is a very clear example of a slide that I would include in a briefing to legislative staff. I'd include it in a briefing to administration folks in the governor's office. And it's this level of very clear articulation of what we're trying to convey that is important. So moving on from those two things, which are the two main pieces that I wanted to start with, and I'll repeat again, which is in order to communicate your science to policy before even starting the science, if you want it to have, if you want to know, you want to communicate it with policymakers, you need to define who those audiences are, who do you mean by policymakers, and you need to craft why you're doing your work and what is needed and what are the messages that are needed for change. And then this is probably a lot of the places where when I read the questions before, people had questions on, which is okay, but how to actually do it and how to actually have the impact. So I've got three categories here that I came up with on how the tools and tricks that we've come up with for communicating with policymakers that have been the most successful for us. And they are to be timely, be credible, be actionable, and repeat. Rinse and repeat over and over and over again. We've had some of people who love our work and we work really closely with tell us that they've needed to hear something between 10 and 15 times before they've been able to understand it or act on it. So communicating science to policy also requires some patience, and I'll get into that a little bit more. So to start, to be timely. So when you're working with those who work in policy, you're working with a group of people, a lot like the media, who are acting mainly on the now. They're acting on what matters to people now. They're acting on what matters to their bosses now. They're acting on what matters to the electorate now. They're acting in reaction to what's happening in the weather or the news. So it's really important to be timely and to recognize when the science that you're doing has direct connections to what's happening in the world. And that's not to say that there are not a lot of people out there who are doing really forward-thinking work or doing planning work or creating policy to anticipate the next big challenge, because that's happening as well. But by being timely, I don't mean just only doing science that means something for what's happening in today. I mean doing work that can be connected in some way to what matters to policymakers now. So don't waste opportunities to connect your work with current events. So on the slide now, and the picture that I have up there now, I just have that up there because this was our Twitter feed this morning at PPIC Water. And you can see that we are just talking about floods today, and that's because we're in the middle of an atmospheric river and rain is coming down. So we're using this opportunity to just put back out in the world work that we've done on flooding and important flooding work, to connect it in current events, so that since it's top of mind. I've not seen in my time doing this anything as motivating for policymakers as a crisis. A lot of policy on California water was passed during the drought and right after the drought, and we can expect that to continue. So telling your audience why it matters now is also really important. So let's say you can't find a really good connection to something that's happening in the weather or the news, but you could tell them why it matters, that action is needed now. So a lot of this, when you're thinking about science communication, is important, because a lot of the times you're doing work that maybe is about forecasting for future challenges or trying to prepare for an unknown future. And telling them why it matters now and making that really clear to them is important. You kind of need to do their job a little bit for them in that way. They appreciate it, just like we appreciate when someone helps us with our homework. They appreciate if you tell them why it matters. And then this is another big one, which is to find out when decision making is happening. So if you're doing work and you're trying to make it policy impactful, and you made a cold call, as Megan brought up, or sent an email during the middle of and your audience was the California legislature, and you sent an email in the middle of April, which is when there is a huge push in the California legislature to get the budget passed, and no one's answering emails because they're just trying to pass the budget, then you might miss an opportunity because they're not thinking about it right now, and there's not a lot of decision making that might be happening on that topic during that time. And so when you find your key audiences, like I mentioned before, find out when they are making decisions, and not just making decisions, find out when they're looking for information. So something is about to happen in 2018 in California. We're going to have a gubernatorial election, and we're going to have a new governor starting in 2019. And when there's new governor, there's a huge turnover in state agencies, and there's a lot of new agency staff, and those staff are going to start in a lot of ways fresh, and they're going to think about what their priorities are, and they're going to think about what they want to work on. And that's a really great time to try and get in front of somebody, because they're thinking about what they might want to do. But there's examples of that for every type of policy audience. There's a few months in the fall every year when the California legislature is kind of slow, and that's when they're building their bills for the next year, and that's a really great time to talk to them. That's an example. There's when you think about the like local agencies, usually they have like a fiscal year budget cycle, and if you had science that directly impacted how something is being managed locally, talking to somebody around that fiscal time when they're thinking about what to spend money on could be really impactful. So finding out, once you define who your audience is, finding out when they make decisions or when they need information is really, really useful. So one example of the way that we're doing that right now with a lot of our work is we've been talking about water management in California, and it's the impact of climate change on water management for a long time. And we recently have seen in the last few years some really clear example of climate extremes and variability in California, from the extreme drought to a very wet year in 2017 that caused infrastructure damage and some flooding. So what we kind of did, and this is an example of being timely, is we're connecting what is happening around us to things that we think need to change for climate because of climate change. So we're not just saying climate change is going to have a really big impact. We're saying changing climate will affect snowpack, floods, droughts, and we're connecting it very clearly to things that have been right in front of our policymakers' faces, and then making recommendations around that. So this is just a way of just not you know, using what has been happening as a way to craft the messages. The second big tool to think about for your work, or the trick, is, besides being timely, is to be credible. And scientists and academics, I in a lot of ways, I think that they are inherently credible, fact-based. I mean, you're scientists, so there's not. I think when I was making this slide, I didn't want to. I wanted to articulate that this is just not about being scientific. It's about being useful, and it's about your work being. It's about being taken seriously as an expert in what you do. So some ways in which we try to do that is basing our work in facts, which sounds naive to just, I mean, sounds like a sweet thing, but that is obviously really important. But beyond that, beyond being rigorous and being scientific and being fact-based, there's a few other things that can make your science really credible to policy audiences. The other is to consider all sides. So not to do your work in a vacuum, to make sure that the science that you're doing does not ignore some particular group, that you're making sure that if you're doing work on the economy in some way, that you're not ignoring a really big piece of that, or you're not, you know, tossing to the side a group that maybe you should be. In California Water, this is all about balancing the work that we do to make sure it considers the economy and the environment. And when we're talking about the economy, we're talking about both the rural economy and the urban economy. So we're not doing work that only focuses on one type of group. The other thing to be credible is to work with multidisciplinary teams. And what I mean by that is bringing into your science somebody of a different discipline than you. If you are a biologist working with an economist, or a lawyer, or a hydrologist, if you're a if you're a lawyer, doing the opposite. And that multidisciplinary teams helps you consider all sides, but it also helps you make sure that the work that you're doing is not only applicable to other biologists or other hydrologists or other economists. The other really important thing to be credible is to vet your results with folks outside of academia. So I'm making the assumption that if you want to be communicating science to policy, it's because you want to make an impact on policy and you want to make a change on policy. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that what your results are make sense on the ground in real life. With all the caveats that go with science, with all the things that you want to say that maybe, you know, that go with it, but you want to make sure that you've vetted them at least, and that you can articulate what your conditions of your work are in a way that doesn't turn people off. And you're not giving people information that then they go, well, they did that, but they didn't consider all these other things. You want to at least be able to, if you didn't consider all those other things, you want to at least be able to say, we did this work, we didn't consider these things, but this is still why we think it's important. And then the last thing is to not assume the audience knows as much as you do. So to take the time, building credibility is also about building off your own expertise, but it's also about making sure that that you are bringing people along with you, and that you are not making assumptions that people are at the same starting place as you are when you're talking about science and when you're talking about facts and statistics and information. So if I was talking to somebody about agriculture, and I was talking about irrigation and how to be efficient in agricultural irrigation, I would want to start that by making sure we were all on the same page about what I meant when I said efficient irrigation, and what kind of technology I was talking about, and not just jumping straight into where my starting place was. And that helps you build credibility, and it helps you build expertise. It helps people trust your expertise if you're willing to make sure you guys are all on the same page before you start talking. Why did I put this slide in here? I think this was this was another example of a slide. Oh yeah, so this was another example of a slide that I wanted to show, which is a slide that we have used to get across the point about the farm economy in California. And this is a slide that we use to make the point. We make multiple points with this slide, which helps us with lots of audiences, build credibility, see all sides. And what it does is it, in more than one ways, it just says that the farm economy has been growing while their water use has been declining, and despite droughts. And this is a slide that we get a lot of traction on, and this is a fact and a message we get a lot of traction on because we've built credibility in this field before. So there's folks who come out and say things about farms or say things about the farm economy who haven't considered all sides and done the legwork with this particular stakeholder group. And when they talk about them, they might not get the same they may not be as seen as credible as we have, and that's because this work that we've done on the farm economy is one that we've done hand in hand with a lot of those stakeholders. Okay, and then my last trick and tool is to be actionable. And what I mean by that is when you're communicating your recommendations, to do a few things, which is the first is to consider what's feasible. Don't make recommendations about things that can't actually be done. And part of that goes back to what I mentioned before, which is to vetting your results with people outside academia, vetting results with managers, vetting results with on the ground practitioners, those sorts of things. Recognize the barriers to change. So in order to what a policy maker or a manager loves more than anything else from a scientist or from someone like me at a think tank is if I make a recommendation to them that they can run with. But to run with something, you have to have acknowledged where they're going to maybe hit a barrier and what the challenges are. You can't ignore them. So recognizing those barriers is really important. Also providing alternative pathways. So if your science came up with one ideal solution to something, but there was like a secondary option that could be good as well, or maybe is more of something that you could start with step A and then get to step B, that sort of a thing, providing those pathways is really clear. That very clearly providing those pathways can be really impactful. And then lastly, don't expect everything at once. So that kind of goes back to the same point I just made. So once you articulate who your audience is, what change you want to see, and then you've done the work to inform that change, and you've done your research to inform that change, figure out a way that maybe you can think about phasing out some of the recommendations, or this is what you would start, if I was to make this change, this is what I would start with, and this is where I would go next. Because change is really slow, and so making your recommendations and using your science and using your results in a way that recognize that things will happen in a piecemeal pattern will make it easier for policymakers to understand it and to use it. And then lastly, it's just kind of what I just said, which is to repeat that change takes time, but well-communicated science can definitely make a difference in policy decisions and outcomes. And so going back through those steps of figuring out how to be actionable, how to be credible, and how to be timely, doing those on repeat with the work that you do, you'll get better over time, and you'll start to see, I think, some change in the way that the work that you do is being used by others. And that is all. That's my show.
All right, thank you, Caitrin, for your very informative presentation. At this point, I'd like to open up the lines for questions. Feel free to unmute your microphones and submit your questions. You can also submit them in the chat function. I also have a few questions here in front of me from the previously submitted questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started unless someone else has a question. I'll wait a few seconds. All right, so first question I have is, with scientists, we have sort of we can't really advocate on a position. So do you have any tips on how we can convey key points without appearing to advocate, and some tips and advice on how we can frame messages?
Yeah, so that's very similar to PPIC. So we don't, as an independent think tank, we don't take any positions on policy. We don't say, oh, you should vote for this or that or the other thing. But what we do is we try to, going back, we try to provide these three things: information, set of facts, and recommendations, to help improve policy outcomes. So that's a vague way of saying that just by providing information about something or facts about something, you're not necessarily advocating for one solution or another. And even with recommendations, you can frame your messages in a way, like I mentioned on the be actionable side, is if you are not standing there saying the only solution to climate change is X, and if you don't do that, you're going, you're wrong. If you're not doing that, if you're standing there and saying the goal is for carbon emissions to get to this number by this date, and here are some recommendations or some pathways and ways to get there. If you're providing them actionable recommendations, we think it keeps you out of a place of advocating for something very specific, and it puts you where I think scientists should be, which is providing creative solutions that are informed by informations and analysis and facts. And for me, for us, we've always defined advocacy as being, having blinders on and only going for one answer. And as scientists, if you are providing information, if you're framing your messages in a way that provides the decision makers with better information and facts, and better information and facts can include creative solutions that are possible, then I think you are very safe. You're far away from where I think the danger can come when you're thinking about advocacy.
Great, well said. Building off of that, another huge aspect about scientific research is that there could be a lot of uncertainty. So how do we convey our message with confidence while also caveating our research with that uncertainty?
So we talk about this a lot, and we hear this a lot from the audiences that we have, which is, why would I do anything if all the science is telling me that they're not sure? And this kind of goes back to the actionable part of it, which is to think about, one, to recognize, so my recognized barriers on the slide could also be uncertainty, recognizing uncertainty. And there's a way in which you can recognize uncertainty without undermining the ideas that you have. And one way to do that is to not act as if there's no other answer. So by recognizing your uncertainty, one way of recognizing your uncertainty is to just by simply saying, this is what we know now. We may have to ask this question again in 5 years, but this is what we know right now. And this is what I feel comfortable acting on based on the uncertainty that I, as an expert, am aware of in this particular situation. So this kind of goes back to thinking about things, stepwise or piecemeal, or here's starting point A or starting point B. So you can talk about your science and your uncertainty in a way that says, here's our uncertainties, here's what we don't know, but this is what we do know, and this is what we can act on. And by acting on this piece, this is where we can see change.
Great, that was certainly some good advice. Are there any other questions from the audience? I have a few more questions I could ask, but I'd like to give the chance to anyone else to ask a question. I'll wait a few seconds. All right, so with scientific research, we have a lot of data that we could present. What sort of data and facts is needed, and what should be excluded in these presentations to a policy audience?
I think for me, that goes back to what you're, thinking about what your messages are. So if you got an opportunity to present in front of someone a policymaker, if you were going to go give a briefing somewhere, and you had, decided that the change you wanted to see was, you wanted to see more trees planted in Sacramento, in Davis. You want to see more, like Davis needs more trees, but more trees planted in Davis. And that was the goal or maybe your research said more trees should be planted because then something great would happen. So your message is very clear. When it comes to data and facts, I would only present, I would try and target the data that you present to correlate really cleanly to 2 or 3 key messages. So, and I would present it, we try, or everything I'm saying is kind of our framework, is to present things in a way that is, most policymakers, and a lot of them may be total science nerds and they want to know every detail of your work, but they probably just want to know the outcome and the takeaways and what the key messages are. And so really clear slides and clear figures can help with that. But I think tying your data and your the figures or the graphics that you have directly to what the takeaway messages are is really, really key.
Solid advice. So Caitrin, you sent me links to 2 PPIC materials, which I am linking everybody in the chat right now, as well as we'll be posting on our website. One is called California's Future Briefing Kit, and the other one is called Priorities for California's Water. Did you want to explain a little bit about that?
I just wanted to provide a couple examples, and these will maybe help in a more articulate way than I've been able to answer in these questions about presenting, how to present complicated issues and complicated data in a way that is digestible for policy audiences. These are 2 of our products that we've made that are directly targeted at elected officials. The first one is like a 6-page policy brief that outlines like priorities for water management, and you can see in there's a mix of figures, graphics, photos, really nice facts. And then the other one is a briefing kit on a range of California issues that PPIC works on. And I just wanted to provide some hard examples of both the kind of text, the way that we write for policymakers, the figures that we use for policymakers, and the way that we kind of articulate recommendations and solutions. And hopefully they can provide some examples of how to not cross that line into advocacy, but still provide a lot of useful information.
Great. Thank you very much, Caitrin. So if we want to know more about what you do at PPIC, how can we reach you and find other links to resources?
Yeah, so PPIC is very easy to find, ppic.org, and then the water work is /water, and everything that we do is all up on the web. And you can reach me at chapelle@ppic.org.
Great, thank you so much, Caitrin. I don't see any other questions submitted on the chat, but again, the lines are open. Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. Caitrin, do you mind staying a few minutes just to make sure if anyone has any questions they can ask at this time? But this concludes our workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. This workshop will be posted on our website, and please take this time to submit and write a feedback form. I am linking the link to the feedback form right now. So if you could go ahead and fill that out, that would be so helpful. Okay, I think it was. Let me find the link actually.
Well, thank you to everybody. I hope this was useful. It was, Since it was just the broad idea of science, not a particular topic, I tried to keep it as broad as possible. So if anyone has any specific questions, feel free to follow up with me.
Great. And Eric T says, thanks, good presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll be here for a few minutes to answer any questions that you have, and we look forward to seeing you on the next workshop, May 4th, for infographics.